Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our final seminar of day one at the Sustaining Church Conference. My name's Phil. I'm part of the Hazelnut team here in Bristol and been working with John since the outset, really. So I'm excited to be here at our second Sustaining Church Conference. I'm joined by Thandi, who is going to be speaking to us today, as it says on the slide there, about an olive agenda for putting economic and ecological justice at the heart of faith. Just to give you a little bit of an introduction to Thandi, and I'm sure she can tell us some more about herself in a moment, but she's an activist theologian who's currently a PhD candidate at the Protestant Theological University in the Netherlands. She's got a degree in African Studies and Theology and Development and a degree in Biblical Studies. So lots of experience to draw from. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Are you in the Netherlands right now?
Yes, I'm in the Netherlands at the
Excellent.
moment.
And you're just an hour different to us, so not
Yes.
too bad not as bad as for some people who are further away. So I'm going to hand over to you now. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. I wish to start by thanking the organizers and conveners of this conference for giving me an opportunity to share some of my reflections on the theme, Sustaining Church, Reimagining Communities of Faith in Climate Crisis. My reflection is primarily based on an article I wrote in 2016 titled Reflecting on Sustainability Through the Gaze of Rural Malawi. So my accent is a Malawian accent. I'm a Dutch Malawian, so I hope that everything that I'll say will be clear. The article I wrote in 2016 focused on the olive agenda, which I'll discuss later in this paper. My reflection is also slightly adapted from a paper I presented earlier this month at the GEM School in Berlin. That was around the theme, putting economic and ecological justice at the heart of faith. So I want to begin my reflection by taking us to a scene in Ekari Mbvundula's short story titled Montague's Last. The short story is set in early 19th century France, and in it we encounter the protagonist Imamu, or Montague, as his captor has renamed him. So I just want to show you the cover of that short story and the writer of that book. So Imamu on the left there is an enslaved and an imprisoned inventor. He's also a mystic and is an alchemist. In the scene, Imamu is in a dungeon dying from a health condition. His last act of love is transforming wood into metal to complete an invention he wishes to leave to his daughter. Closing his eyes, he presses a length of splinter within his flesh, and addressing the splinter, he makes the following incantation in a grinding mix of French and Chewa. He says, "You who were once a tree became this bench. You who were once my bench became the tool in my hands. Now you will change from mother tree to father silver. Your life of wood is no more." This scene captured my attention, not just because of the alchemy aspect, but because in our day-to-day lives, many of us are not likely to look at our furniture or our tools and think of the trees they originate from. We may perhaps remember where we purchased them or who gave them to us, but we rarely, according to Imamu, think mother tree. Similarly, many of us are unlikely to consider products made from silver and other metals as father silver, father gold, or father copper. Jordan Steer explains that in science fiction and fantasy literature, magical elements are assigned as female and industrial elements are assigned as male. And for our discussion, I refer to these two assigned notions to highlight our need to approach nature as a holistic entity. This is in line with scholars like Maserole Khari Masondo, who explains that for the Sotho Tswana people of Southern Africa, nature is defined as that which is created and everything in it, the environment. She adds that from this perspective, nature is an inclusive term, a revelation of creation in any space called, quotes, home. Thus, nature as an inclusive term bears no distinction between natural resources, such as mother tree, and the products we commodify from it. For all things are summed up in Modimo, the creator and sustainer of the universe. This is a contrary perspective to many of our lived realities today, where nature is seen less as summed up in God's creation and sustenance, but regarded more as for our consumption and benefit. And this is evidenced by humanity's parceling out of nature into commodities and thereby placing it under the fragile balance between our economic desires and ecological justice. It is not for nothing that this scene from Imamu's story is set in early, I forgot to go to the next slide to show that was the incantation that was happening. It is not for nothing that this scene from Imamu's story is set in the early 19th century Europe. Scholars like Masarole Cristina Hari Masondo highlight how the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century drastically altered the relationship between humans and their environment. The Industrial Revolution changed how scientific authority, political and economic ends, and capitalist demand for labor, goods, and markets affected our codependence relationship with the environment. Thus, in many colonized societies in the 19th and 20th centuries, the relationship to ecology ceased to be defined along the lines of nature's maternal characteristics, such as Mother Nature, as it was defined historically in these places, and became defined in terms of being a resource. The Industrial Revolution and its resultant influence globally in the ensuing years also impacted inventions that revolutionized industries and technology. This includes the forgotten or overlooked inventors who held no status to claim or let alone direct how their inventions would be used commercially in ways that would reflect their values. Today, in a much broader sense, when we think of economic and ecological justice, we may think of sustainable lifestyles that provide for people, animal life, and nature in ways that ensure that all thrive. We may think, for example, of an idealized African village that features in nostalgia-rich works of fiction. Such nostalgia conjures up images of huts made from materials sourced in the immediate environment, such as wood, thatching, and mud, all intentionally put together to keep people safe from the elements and provide a welcoming, healthy, and happy home. Such a hut is ideal due to its biodegradable nature when made from naturally occurring materials. Even the maintenance agents for such a hut's floors are biodegradable. So you have water, soil, or cow dung. Mobility is also possible. If you want to relocate, there are no expensive windows, bricks, floor tiles, corrugated iron roofing, etc., to leave behind or risk damaging when searching for a better life. All you may need to take with you are the basics. You will find whatever else you need in the environment around your destination, where you will likely rely on what is grown locally and seasonally. In this imagination of village life, one is sustained by the environment and coexists with it serenely. But upon a closer look, the reality is that the village scene I described is unrealistic. Nature is as unpredictable as humans. Natural disasters occur as often as human conflicts. Today, rural to urban migration in under-resourced rural communities in countries like Malawi, where I come from, is high. Among the reasons for this is that sustainable living in a rural area is rarely a lifestyle choice. People seek opportunities to improve their lives, so moving to urban areas is considered a part of such improvement. That is to say, the opportunity to live in an urban setting and have access to jobs or business opportunities attracts many due to its promise of upward mobility, convenience, and permanence. From such a perspective, it is not a surprise that for many, the promise of an improved livelihood, though never guaranteed, often outweighs concerns about the cost such livelihoods collectively have on the environment in terms of, say, higher carbon and ecological footprints. Thus, when we take the case of rural to urban migrant labor on its own, there is a mix of economic and ecological concerns that provide a microcosm through which to theologize our theme, putting economic and ecological justice, or my theme rather, putting economic and ecological justice at the heart of faith. From a theological point of view, we must consider that we do not have to choose between caring for the environment and humanity's progress or comfort and well-being. The two are not mutually exclusive. Instead of setting up such dichotomies, it is better to pursue the well-being of both our economies and natural environments. Such an approach better reveals for us Genesis 1, where we read that God, pleased with his creation of humanity, that's Genesis 1:28, and nature, maybe I'll just put up the verses. So the two are not mutually exclusive. Instead of setting up such dichotomies, it is better to pursue the well-being of both our economies and natural environments. Such an approach better reveals for us Genesis 1, where we read that God, pleased with his creation of humanity and nature, assigns us the responsibility to care for his creation. In that relationship of care, A, our nourishment and needs are provided for by nature around us, Genesis 1:29. B, and from us, nature must get what it needs to keep the balance it needs to survive and thrive, Genesis 1:26. From this perspective, our relationship with nature is a blessing rather than a curse to the earth, Isaiah 24, verse 4 through 6, or a burden to humanity, Genesis 3:17 through 19. In light of this notion, Omakangele, that's a Nigerian theologian, argues that when God gave humanity, quote unquote, dominion over his creation, according to Genesis 1:28 in some translations, dominion was intended to invoke the recognition of our interdependence with nature. This interpretation of dominion contrasts with that of others that interpret it as God's sanctioning of the rampant exploitation of nature for profit. A theological method that looks at how we may sustain nature in response to its sustaining us is the olive agenda, developed by the late South African theologian Steve de Gruchy. De Gruchy brings together economic and ecological injustice, arguing that the two are always interconnected. Brian Conkle explains that this theological metaphor, the olive, transcends the duality between the green and brown agendas that has disabled dialogue for the past generations. As a result, an olive agenda, one that combines green and brown, provides a profound metaphor that, according to de Gruchy, holds together that which religious and political discourse rends apart: earth, land, climate, labor, time, family, food, nutrition, health, hunger, poverty, power, and violence. In other words, the olive agenda brings together the so-called brown agenda and green agenda. The brown agenda addresses environmental problems in developing countries as they affect the environment and local populations, particularly the poor. The green agenda is concerned with global environmental issues, with efforts usually led by industrialized nations. Bringing the two together into a literal color and agenda blend, the olive agenda is about the following, and I quote, "The search for social regeneration, as humans are confronted with these two agendas, the brown agenda with its focus on poverty and the green agenda with its focus on the environment. While both are fundamentally right, taken in isolation from the other, each is tragically wrong. And thus we must integrate economy as oikos-nomos and ecology as oikos-logos in search for sustainable life on earth, the oikos that is our only home," end quote. What does sustainability look like in the olive agenda? The olive agenda emphasizes that in our theology of economic and ecological justice, the interpretation of an economy of shalom or salam as God's economy that takes into account all of creation must play a central role. According to de Gruchy, we are responsible for ensuring that our need for convenience and comfort does not come at the expense of God's creation. Wanton consumerism that promotes plundering the earth's resources should not carry pride and prestige. At the same time, conserving and adapting our comfort and convenience into sustainable forms of living should not be looked down upon as primitive or a lifestyle choice. The earth should thrive as we thrive. This should be our attitude towards God's creation. So in conclusion, in practical terms, if we turn to Imamu's or Montague's story, interdependence includes understanding that what we consume as finished products, such as the silver object he transformed from wood, They derive from our finite ecological resources. Understanding this helps us approach examples like the rustic and nostalgic image of an African village addressed earlier, with the awareness that human livelihoods and the environment's welfare are under strain more often than not, and interventions are needed also from a theological perspective. Simplistic, limited, and perhaps misgendered binaries aside, a more holistic approach to Earth as both our mother, ecology, and father, economy, so to say, needs theologies like the Olive Agenda to remind us that we cannot sustain one without the other. In approaching the Olive Agenda, I am inspired by the two-winged theology metaphor advocated by Mercy Amba Oduyoye in her critique of patriarchy. In her critique, she uses the symbol of a flying bird to explain that theology without the faith reflections of women is like a bird with only one wing, disabled and unable to take off to the air. In similar ways, in the case of economic and ecological justice, the two are not separate, but can also be symbolized as two wings that inform theologies under the theme that we're talking about today. We must pursue both by theologically reflecting and advocating for both, because an emphasis on only one at the expense of the other is like expecting a one-winged bird to fly. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much for taking the time to not only think all of that through, but to present it to us in such a creative and imaginative and yet clear way. Yeah, so much to think about there. We do have a few minutes now. If anyone would like to ask any questions, any points of clarification, if you would just like to stick your questions into the chat, if you do have any, or any comments on what's been said here. But that's for me is quite a new idea, this Olive Agenda, and so but definitely one that I can see that image at the end that you used of the one-winged bird is really resonating with me, and I would definitely be looking into this more as I continue my studies. So thank you for that. I did have one question of clarification. You halfway through you referenced a Nigerian theologian. I wondered if you could just repeat his name for me, please.
His name is Omar Kangele, and I'll just type it in the chat.
Wonderful, thank you. That would be really helpful. Okay, great. Yeah, I think what his point was very well made. It's a point that I've heard made before, but the way that he articulated it was particularly good. So yeah.
I'd just like to add, though, that in his article, he used the word stewardship, and I used the word interdependence, because at the time that he wrote the article, stewardship was, it was the preferred word. But then since then, there's been a lot of discussion about the agency of nature as well. So there's a discussion that as theologians, we have to be careful about using words like stewardship, because sometimes it sort of like denies nature its agency. So I think that whole discussion, I find it very interesting. And so therefore I use the word interdependence, but he used stewardship some years ago.
Okay, that was interesting, because that is particularly what stood out to me, that word interdependence. And I think you're right. The term stewardship is very sort of questioned, and we had a lot of talk about that last year at our conference. So I think we've maybe got a comment here from John. The graphic with the differing perspectives on the green and brown agendas, is there a graphic of how the olive brings them together? So is there something visual that you know of that could bring together those two agendas?
I could look. My suspicion is that it's not there, because Professor Steve de Gruchy passed away at the time when he was developing this. So, but I could look for it. But he was just beginning with the Olive Agenda, and then he was involved in an accident, and so he didn't publish a lot yet. And but I could look.
Wonderful, thank you. We've got another question from John Anderson this time, and he's just asking if you could expand a bit more on how the kind of green agenda can lead to thinking of affluence and overconsumption, partly because that's not his experience.
I'm not sure I understand the question very well, but I'll just try. I think what de Gruchy was arguing was that I'll just answer from the African perspective. The African perspective sees issues about the environment as life and death issues. You know, if you don't have a good harvest, then you're not going to have food for your family. While as from the green agenda, it's more about, you know, very global. It doesn't always affect people on the personal level. In many cases, it does, but not on the daily level as it does in poorer economies. So, yeah, I don't know if that gets to your question, but I could clarify more if you could touch on exactly what you wanted to get clarity on.
I think he's typing a response right now, but I think that does bring some clarity, perhaps. There's the slide again that some people have been asking for. If you wanted to just take a picture or screenshot it. John says that green means justice for all in the world. I think perhaps, John, that is from what I've understood, kind of what the olive agenda is getting at. So you're right that words and associations with words can be quite tricky. I don't know if you were in our session that we just had with Joe Knight, but he talked a lot about how the words we use can cause either people to be on the side of an agenda or against it. I think he was talking from Wendell Berry. So I encourage you to explore what Joe Knight said when the videos go up on YouTube, because I think that might help to kind of answer some of what you're asking, really. Let's see if we've got anything else. It looks like that might be all the questions we have for you today. It's been quite a long afternoon with lots of content, lots of things to think about. So do take a good break before our session this evening, and maybe go and do something outside and go and find some of that natural world that we've been talking about. But thank you again, Thandi, for everything you've shared. That was, as I said, really creative. I love the way you drew in things of our imagination and vivid imagery to help us to engage with the quite rich theology that you were presenting. So thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And thank you to everyone else who's joined us. I hope you've had a good afternoon so far. And obviously we've got our final session this evening with Shane Claiborne. So that will be in kind of the main session room, so room 1, and that's at 7 o'clock. So yeah, good to see you all. John, did you want to say anything before we go? All good.